I'll start off firstly by talking about the concept of coastal foreshore reserves. These are basically protection strips along our coast that are aimed at really protecting significant places, protecting ecosystem services, but of course also providing land for everyone to access the coast. Another way to consider the natural resource management issues are to look to minimise environmental impacts of any kind of protection works that are undertaken, and particularly things like rock walls exacerbating erosion and the potential for sand renourishment to actually have problems in terms of smothering seagrass beds and onshore reefs. And also adaptation plans that can learn from nature is something I'm going to just touch on briefly. Mother Nature's pretty good at producing a dynamic coast, and there's a few lessons we can perhaps learn from looking at the coastal environment in terms of a natural perspective. I won't talk too much about coastal foreshore reserves, mostly because of the fact that Geraldton already has its coastal foreshore reserves. The map we've got over here, but this is actually Drummond Cove, and this small brown strip, this grey strip rather, along the coast is actually the coastal reserve. You can see in the scheme of things it's pretty narrow, and it probably doesn't really provide the extent of protection we would perhaps like in terms of coastal erosion. The coastal reserve is obviously the area of land between the ocean and the houses, and long ago our forefathers saw fit to build houses quite close to the sea, so hence we're having some of these discussions now. If we'd managed to set our houses a fair way back, it wouldn't have been as much an issue, unfortunately. Having said that, there is the concept of developing foreshore reserves for new developments, not for existing but for new. And I've just put this map up of a rather controversial area known as Southgates at the moment. And this is a map showing a proposed foreshore reserve area for the potential subdivision that has been proposed for the Southgates Dunes. This is not set in stone, obviously. This is just a proposal at this stage, but it just gives an example of where you've got a foreshore reserve that's been put in place to actually provide some protection for some houses that might potentially go in here. The reason I bring up the concept of the foreshore reserve is that Southgates itself actually is home to a number of TECs. Now, TECs are threatened ecological communities, and this map here actually shows some of those TECs, although it does have a rather large buffer zone around them. This little patch of vegetation just to the north of Southgates Dunes is quite a significant piece of vegetation. It's acacias and eucalyptus on sandy soils. It's quite poorly represented in the northern agricultural region and actually in West Australia in general. So here's the potential for a foreshore reserve to actually provide some protection to those TECs. And in this particular case, this is what's happening here. We've got a foreshore reserve combined with a conservation reserve aiming to actually look after a couple of TECs that occur in the area. This is just one example along our coastline. We do have some other TECs in the Catchments River, and we have other TECs just north of Drummonds as well. So there are some quite significant vegetation complexes right on our coast that I think we need to sort of throw into the mix a bit and to talk about in terms of what we protect, and certainly minimise the impacts on those particular systems. Another thing that coastal foreshore reserves seek to actually help or to maintain is ecosystem services. Natural rocky shores are fantastic natural coastal protection, and the coastal reserves seek to protect those. And we've got a sort of increasing discussion going on at the moment about the ecosystem services provided by places like Southgates Dunes in terms of being a sediment source. There is a study showing that the dunes themselves contribute a lot of wind-blown sand into the littoral system, which is the nearshore coastal system, a very important ecosystem service provided. Minimising impacts from protection works is, I think, something that's probably fairly close to many people in Geraldton's heart. And the concept is that when you do put a hard structure on a dynamic coastal system, what you tend to do is just transfer and even amplify the problem elsewhere on the coast. This is a photo from the US, obviously, but this is a lot closer to home. This is Drummond's, and this is an initial rock wall went in to protect Batten Hall, and very soon after there, the transferred erosion to immediately north of that particular rock wall was quite significant, requiring further rock walls. Look, it's all part of a learning process. These rock walls were put in certainly with the best of intent at the time, but I think now is time to really have a bit of a look about, considering the impacts of some of these protection works and being a little bit more careful and considered about how we go about undertaking some of these works. Just a few other considerations in terms of what goes on the coast. One of the major concerns of community, and rightly so, is that when you do get these erosion banks that take out road bases, you end up with a lot of rubble on the beach. Certainly, beach life in Geraldton is a pretty high value, and to have a lot of rubble on the beach is not desirable. So we certainly encourage the rapid removal of any kind of hard structures from erosion banks before they end up on the beach. Certainly happening more and more, and this is a car park at Thirsty Point in Cervantes that was removed soon after that. The rubble here has stayed put, and whilst it does get covered over at times, when you get a bit more erosion, it tends to surface again. So not a desirable thing. So as soon as we decide that we need to remove some infrastructure from the coast, such as, for instance, White Hill Road, maybe it's a good idea to pull it off fairly quickly, so we don't impact too much on the amenity on the beach. Obviously, once rock walls do go in, clearly there is a loss of beach altogether, so another consideration to take into account. There's been some question about the efficacy or perhaps the potential impacts of sand renourishment, and certainly encourage a bit more investigation to be done into the best ways to renourish. Certainly after we get renourishment works done along Beresford, we do tend to get a number of phone calls about people concerned about seagrass beds and the potential of smothering of reefs. Both of those are very important ecosystems in our society and in our coastal environment. So we certainly encourage a close look at that. And of course we've got, these are sand traps. So there's a number of different ways to do sand trapping, but sand trapping is very effective in actually capturing sand during the summer period, which of course helps to bolster and reinforce your coast. Using plastic, not so good, but yeah, thankfully things have certainly changed in that regard. And now we actually have the latest round of sand trapping that's gone in at Separation Point is biodegradable jute matting, which is fantastic. The downside there, of course, was that some hoons took a dislike to it and managed to destroy it all. So there's other issues to be battled there. This was a very important strategy to try and capture a bit of sand and to bolster the defences of Separation Point, but unfortunately we've lost that temporarily. And of course, back to the natural solutions. This is a large foreshore reserve example that's part of Jurien Bay, so a highly desirable arrangement. And of course, this is essentially the kind of way of the future in terms of future developments under SPP 2.6. These are the kind of setbacks that strategy from now on will dictate. Another interesting lesson, this is of course Grays Beach. This is the recent revetment works, and it's quite a nice effect in terms of there's been some really nice free vegetation gone along. There's native vegetation's been planted along the exposed site. This is of course exposed to the southerlies, so it really gets hammered by salt winds, and the selection of the right species for that particular environment's provided this nice thick vegetation belt, and over time that will thicken, the roots will deepen and provide extra protection as well. So another good example of natural systems providing some good protection outcomes. I just threw this one in as a little bit left of field one. This is actually a picture of an artificial reef in India. I'm not sure, Clint, you probably know a little bit more about artificial reefs. I'm sure there's some potential for them to be used as coastal protection works, but certainly I think they're fairly fraught with danger in terms of the modelling that would, the potential effects of changing in currents, changing sea levels. So not the be-all and end-all, but certainly part of the mix there. A benefit to these structures too is that they can actually be used as fish attracting devices, and they have other benefits as well. So, and in all of this, of course, it's very important to keep up with the latest research. A quick search on the web will bring up all sorts of information, but not much of the particularly relative to or relevant to the Australian condition. This was quite a nice brochure I picked up from Victorian state government, working with nature to protect the coast. I know it's a bit hard to read, but basically it's talking about some coastal hazard management issues, and one of the kind of interim techniques that it advocates is the use of sand trapping to bolster your sea defences. So the first one is sand trapping. The next one up is geotech. So geotech is a soft material, and it's being used quite extensively by the city now for some of its reinforcement works. Geotech bags have just gone in down at Town Beach around the disability access way there, so good to see that coming into play. Beach renourishment, of course, we know about. And then, of course, it goes on to say that, of course, you need to do the proper planning, which is what we're doing at the moment. So just an example of some good information that's come out of other states in Australia. This one's 2013, I think.